Hello and welcome to the 538 Politics Podcast. My name is Jody Avirgan. There are just 3 weeks left until Election Day, and we are going to focus on who plans on turning out and which groups of voters could make the difference for either party. In particular, we will talk about the gender gap and how powerful a force that may be 3 weeks and 1 day from today. Here with me to discuss it all, our editor-in-chief, Nate Silver. Hello, Nate.
Hi, Jody.
He finds new and interesting ways to make it awkward every week.
That was remarkable.
Hi.
Because the pause, if it had been any longer, then it would have been like suspenseful. If it had been any shorter, it would have been normal. But he really nailed
the
that
weirdness.
Awkward pause.
Yeah.
Senior politics writer Claire Malone is here. Hello, Claire.
Hi, Jody.
See, that's how it's done. And managing editor Micah Cohen. Hello, Micah.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, so warm and wonderful. By the way, thanks to everyone who came out to our live shows. That was really fun, but it's nice to be back in the cozy confines of our usual studio here.
The windowless cell in which you record this.
There's a window. It just looks into another room that has no windows in it. Also today, 3 weeks from the midterm, we're going to talk about what happens one day after the midterm, which might be the official, unofficial start of the 2020 presidential primary. We've done some analysis looking at who is checking the boxes you would expect of someone who is running for president, like who's written a book or visited Iowa or campaigned for fellow party members. Do we need to add who's done a DNA test to prove their Native American heritage to that list? Is there a checkbox for that?
Has there ever been a clearer I'm running for president move than that?
Okay, so save that thought, save that question, because we will talk about that later. But let's begin actually with the midterms, who plans to vote and for whom. We asked folks on Twitter actually what demographic groups they're focused on. Not surprisingly, a lot of people responded and said they're looking at the gender gap, which has been the big story of the 2018 midterms so far. Women appear much more likely to vote for Democrats. So I'll ask all of you the big question, then we'll kind of get into some of the details. But can Democrats score a wave based on gender gap alone? If there is a Democratic wave, does the gender gap, which now stands at 35 points, is that going to be the engine that powers that wave?
The women.
The gender gap tells you nothing about the likelihood of a wave because it's a gap.
Mm-hmm.
Can Democrats win the House by doing really, really well among women and okay among men?
That's
Sure.
the question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it
Of
is.
course.
It's an interesting difference. Janie Valenti had an interesting piece for us that was like the gender gap could actually narrow in a way that helps Democrats if men became more likely, as there's a little evidence for, at least pre-Kavanaugh, of voting for Democrats. But I do think, Nate's point about the gender gap notwithstanding, that doing really well among women is enough for Democrats to take the House. Is that right? Anybody want to put
As long as they don't do really, really bad among dudes.
Yes. No, but that's right. Yeah. So in a weird way, it's like if the gender gap is too big, it could be bad.
Because it shows it takes two to create a gender gap.
Yes, it does. Yes.
Claire, any thoughts here about kind of, we've talked about this for so long, the role of women in this election being defined by women.
We know there are more women candidates, which might have effects for party pipelines in elections going forward. So that's one interesting thing. We know that women are already more likely to vote than men, or vote at a higher rate than men.
Yes.
And that groups of women that are already vote at higher rates among women are extremely active this year. So older, college-educated white women. I guess I'm interested to see the demographics of whether or not, younger women, more minority women, particularly Latino women. I'm interested to see if those numbers change at all, those participation rates move up at all this year. I think that'll be really interesting to break down those below the top line numbers. So that's kind of what I'm keeping my eye on right now.
Yeah, in a similar vein, I'm really interested in white women without a bachelor's degree. In 2016, in the 2016 presidential election, a lot was made of the gender gap, right? But Trump won. Claire wrote about this right after the election. Trump won the white women, right? And he won, according to the exit polls, white women without a college degree handily, 61 to 34%, right? But an ABC News Washington Post poll came out the other day that showed, it's just one poll, so take it with a grain of salt, but it showed non-college white women still leaning towards Republicans, but leaning towards Republicans 49% to 43%. So the GOP with this group, went from having a 27-point edge to, according to the ABC Post poll, a 6-point edge. That's a huge shift and much bigger than, white women with a college degree have also gotten more Democratic. But again, just comparing these two data points, they've gone from a 7-point edge to a 15-point edge. It's a shift, but not quite as big. So white women without a college degree, I think, are really interesting.
Yeah, and we did talk about them a lot after the election because there were a couple of buzzy takeaways that people had from the women's vote in the 2016 election. So largest gender gap in American electoral history, I believe, from the presidential level, with American women overall voting for Clinton. But then when you broke down white women, I thought the class difference between white women, it's an unfortunate proxy, but we kind of give education level as a proxy for class, I think, in a lot of ways. Correct me if I'm wrong in saying that. So white women with a college education voted for Clinton and white women without a college education voted for Trump. And I just found that break striking. And in the past couple of years, there's been, I think, a lot of interesting writing and points about, and this is another podcast altogether, but, the way that feminism and politics and equal pay and women's equality in the workplace have played out differently for college-educated, let's say, white-collar women versus working-class women in general. And I would say white blue-collar women or working-class women have a different conception of feminism, I think. And that's something that's really interesting that I do think played out in 2016.
This gets to something Nate wrote over the weekend, but Nate, tell me if you think this is too takey, but sort of doubling down on some of these differences among women. But I feel like, to oversimplify, Democrats can win the House by doing well among white women with a college degree. But if they are going to have any chance in the Senate, they probably also need to do relatively well among white women without a college degree.
Yeah, the Senate battlegrounds are not very heavy on college-educated cities and districts. And that explains some of the splits that we might be seeing. Even some of the Senate races that are more purple, like Nevada, for example. Nevada actually is a fairly working-class state. And so therefore, is it Nevada or Nevada? I always
had this conversation
it's
for 2 years.
It's Nevada.
Because it's like...
It's Nevada.
It's like when you get in your head that you have it wrong, you like double flip sometimes, right?
Uh-huh.
It's like we have a great editor we work with named Megan, and I always want to say Megan because I know it's not Megan, so I want to say Megan, but then I know is it wrong? Therefore, I go back to
right. But
I'm insulted for you, Megan.
I got so used to Megan that then we had another editor named Megan who was working with us for a little bit, and I just started calling her Megan all the time.
I call both of them Nevada. The question was...
It was, how do you pronounce everyone's name?
Yeah, exactly. The question was, can Democrats win the Senate just by focusing on white women with a college degree, or do they really need to focus on other demographic groups as well?
No, if they're really, really overperforming with that group, then that will lead to them doing perfectly well in the House and having a lot of problems in the Senate.
A lot of problems in the Senate.
Put gender aside for a second. The battleground races in the Senate are much more rural and much more Republican, much more small state, much more their education levels are lower than in the House. Now, in the House, the battleground is still relatively, it's like slightly Republican leaning, but it's more suburban and exurban, right, Nate? And it's more educated. So it's just much, much different battlegrounds.
So is there a zero-sum game there if you're like the Democratic Party and you're deciding where to spend your money and where to put your resources and who to target? Does trying to take back the House inherently mean you're not focusing on the things that will help you take back the Senate?
It could be a zero-sum game. This is why, all the election takes after Kavanaugh, normally I would be predisposed to, just be this isn't going to have an effect. It'll pass, blah, blah, blah. But, as long as, again, let's narrow our focus to women again for a second. As long as the 2018 campaign is about Trump, it feels like Democrats can do well with both college-educated women and non-college women, right? The second you get into some of these cultural issues that Claire was getting at, then it does feel like an either-or choice, right? And where some of your messaging is going to be really appealing to college-educated women, but perhaps turn off non-college-educated women. So when Kavanaugh was in the news, it did feel like a choice. I think now maybe it feels like less of a choice.
Yeah, I think the Kavanaugh debate was bad for Senate Democrats
Yeah.
running in contested states because it brought up issues they don't want to talk about. They don't want to talk about culture issues. They want to talk about, we are saving Obamacare for you. Like, they want to talk about that stuff, and they want to say things like, I'm a reasonable politician who works across the aisle. Those are like the two things I think that, like, which by proxy is sort of saying, like, I'm okay with Trump and I'm okay with Republicans, and I'm not going to go like crazy and push for legislation that you're not okay with from a cultural point of view. But the moment that the biggest controversy in American society kind of got brought up, which was a mishmash of partisanship and sexual assault and all this stuff, that became bad for them. And I think it's hard to pivot back in the last month. I mean, you saw Heidi Heitkamp preemptively rolling out ads that were explaining her Kavanaugh vote, you know, and in some ways it's like she's got to do whatever she can do in the last month to say, like, listen, I'm my own woman. This is why I did that. I hope you still vote for me. But it puts her in a tough spot, I think.
It does, but don't you guys kind of think like that the Kavanaugh moment is passing and will pass?
I don't know. My gut is that it stays in people's minds through November 6th, and that TV ads in certain states won't let people forget that.
I mean, we don't know the extent to which Kavanaugh's confirmation itself had an effect, or it kind of activated partisanship that was likely to be activated all along to some extent. I mean, certainly it makes it hard for the Senate Democrats to kind of stay above the fray and, hey, don't mind me, I don't have any power anyway, right? And so just elect more Democrats or reelect me as a check on Trump.
But coming back to this gender gap question, has that increased since the Kavanaugh event? I mean, are there any sort of particular splits, crosstabs that have hints as to what's happened
guess,
since
right?
Kavanaugh?
But like, I feel like we're being too granular here. I think that like a lot of the takes, this was last week at the live show, you know, a lot of the takes on Kavanaugh and the effect that he had are drawn by like male pundits who are in homosocial networks, right? Especially for Republicans, where the Republican kind of consultant and pollster and expert community is very male. Journalists are pretty male. It hasn't changed that much, maybe a little bit improved. And so the conventional wisdom about like the effects Kavanaugh will have, I think, are governed by that a lot. You know, in our forecast, you now see a clearer split between the House and the Senate, where the GOP Senate chances continue to improve. But the Democrats' House chances actually are back on the upswing now, kind of since the Kavanaugh nomination.
But you're kind of agreeing in some ways, though, with conventional wisdom when it comes to the Senate, right? Because like we could say, it might be Kavanaugh or it might just be partisanship that was activated. But either way, it gets worse for Democrats in the Senate.
I guess my beef, though, is like I think people are maybe ignoring the House a little bit and ignoring the fact that like in the generic ballot,
it's a foregone conclusion for a lot of people. Yeah.
Well, it shouldn't be. I mean, neither of these. I mean, here we're in this weird zone where number one, I don't remember we ever had a split in the forecast like this. I mean, it's pretty unusual. Our colleague Jeff Skelly, Jeff with a G, wrote about how like these splits do happen occasionally. One happened in 1982, right? But like to predict this likelihood of a split is unusual. We're also, I always say this, when we're in the 80-20 zone, and we're now in the 80-20 zone in both places, that makes me nervous because that's when people start to
round up.
My least favorite zone.
And remember, there's almost no chance that Democrats win the Senate but don't win the House, which means that like there's a 40% chance that one of those two predictions will be wrong. So, you know, not quite 50-50, but we call something a toss-up if it's 40% or greater. So almost a toss-up that you'll have one of these forecasts go wrong. And so there's a little bit too much like taking for granted, I think, among people looking at this. But with that said, I mean, the narrative that Kavanaugh had been a boon for the GOP, I think, had some support in the data. Maybe there was a little bit of cherry picking. Now, a week later, we see the GOP holding the gains they made in the Senate. However, Democrats have rebounded to almost a new high in the House and almost a new high on the generic ballot. And so it looks like more of a split decision.
I've been thinking a lot about the split in the forecast reflecting trends of 2016 where the popular vote went for Clinton and the margins were run up in bigger states, in suburban and urban areas, and Trump won the Electoral College based on his performance in more spread out places, like smaller areas. And it's kind of like the original balance of power in the legislative branch, right? Where it's the Senate is supposed to give the power to equalize the power for smaller states, which is what you're seeing happening right now, right? Which is like smaller, more rural states are going for one party, and then you're seeing in like the bigger, like almost in my head, like the popular vote analog of the House.
Nate, Mike, I know you want to jump in on that, so hold that thought, and we'll be back in a second. We're going to continue that conversation and talk about some other demographic groups. But first, let me tell you that today's podcast is brought to you by WeWork. Whether you're a team of 2 or 200 at WeWork, space matters. From single-desk solutions and innovative amenities to flexible private offices designed to grow along with your headcount, WeWork gives your business the space it needs to connect, focus, build, and succeed. And it's also, as you may have heard, a pretty good place to do a live podcast. WeWork now has over 280 locations across more than 70 cities in 24 countries around the world, making it the perfect partner for your next satellite office, regional headquarters, or remote employees. If you're one of these people who has a business that's growing, one of the most annoying things to deal with is space for all of your growing workforce to work in. Well, WeWork can help take care of that. Your team members spend over a third of their time in your office space, so why not make it exceptional? Everything from IT and maintenance to security, cleaning, wellness programming, and cold brew on tap is handled by WeWork. WeWork provides the intentional design, infectious energy, and outstanding service your team needs in order to just show up and do what they do best. Find out all about it right now at WeWork.com. Find a location near you today. Maybe go visit it, check it out. Go to WeWork.com for more. All right, we're back, and Claire was talking about the split in the forecast. Nate, you want to pick up that thought, and then Micah, you can jump in?
I mean, yeah, look, we are forecasting Democrats to win the popular vote for the House by 8 or 9 percentage points with a big margin of error, which is not coincidentally about where the generic ballot is right now. That's a huge margin.
That's crazy.
That's, I think bigger than 2006 or 1994 or 2010. It's all pretty close, right? But like it's a point or two better than most of those. I think they tend to be clustered in like a 6 or 7 point win. Despite that forecast, we show Republicans gaining half a seat on average in the Senate. We do show Democrats now picking up a median of 35, an average of 37 House seats. So that's a pretty big gain, but like it's also still a 1 in 5 chance that they don't win the House. And if they only win the popular vote by 5 or 6 points, we have them only about break even to take the House. So you don't need that large a polling error. You could have a scenario where Democrats lose 3 Senate seats, just barely win the House, but also win the House popular vote by 8 points, win all these governorships. So we're leading maybe to an election outcome where the interpretation is pretty messy. What people might not realize, though, is that you can have these really blue inputs, have a really blue popular vote, and have it turn out into only a narrow Democratic majority in the House, into Democrats losing seats in the Senate where they're not performing well on a race-by-race basis, number one, and the territory is really, really red, number two. Governors and state legislatures will finally have a governor forecast coming out this week, and you'll see we project Democrats to control roughly 3/5 of the population afterward in governor's races, right? Which in some ways is a pure test because governor's races are just states and they're not gerrymandered in any way. But you see like the effects that electoral systems have on the race.
I'll just jump in quickly and point out that, we've been saying this all along, but somewhere around 6 or 7 points is where things start to get favorable for Democrats, a 6 or 7 point advantage. So when we're talking about 8.6, as Nate said, that's big, but it's not that far above the place where Democrats need to be to even start to kind of have an advantage.
And that's only to be a favorite to win the House, right?
Yeah, there's our different models have different numbers that range from 5.5 to 7. But, in that 5, 6, 7, 8 zone is where I think it becomes interesting.
But let me make a couple of points. Claire's comparison of this to the Electoral College is like dead on in my view.
My God, thank you.
But you thought I was going to be like, that is the dumbest comparison.
I actually did.
That is right on in my view. And we wrote this in the run-up to the 2016 election, but there was this weird threshold Clinton hovered above and below where the Electoral College, and she ended up being right below the threshold, and the Electoral College ended up working against her, right? Where if she had won the popular vote by, 2 or 3 or 4 more percentage points, all of a sudden you go from losing the Electoral College to a bunch more states being in play, right? We see the same thing in the House, where if you're a Democrat, you might look at the generic ballot or look at our popular vote and be like, oh my God, 8, 9 points. But if the polls have an average error, which, a couple points, then all of a sudden they're back in coin flip territory. just two other really quick points. One, I think Claire's right that the House has become like this proxy for the popular vote, and the Senate has become this like proxy for the Electoral College. That itself is super ironic because of what we just talked about. The House itself is like a Republican tinged representation of the popular vote. And then last point is this whole conversation is why I think white women without a college degree are such an important demographic for Democrats. Most of the groups that lean Democratic are inefficiently distributed in terms of the Electoral College, definitely, but also in terms of the Senate this year and in terms of the House to some extent. If they start doing better among non-college white women, though, that's a group that helps them in some of these places where doing better among Hispanics, doing better among black voters, doing better among college-educated voters doesn't help you that much. For example, Nevada. Yeah. So whether this election is about Trump or about some of these cultural issues, I think will make a big difference.
But it is like the reason why the split between white women is so interesting and it, like college educated versus non. Republican women without a college education often resent the way they are portrayed in, I think, popular culture or popular feminist perceptions of the country. Like, I think you'll talk to a lot of Republican women and they'll say, really irritates me that I'm cast as not a feminist or whatever. I'm cast in a certain way because I'm a Republican. And I actually think that gets to something about and this goes all the way back to the women's movement, which in the 70s was started by a lot of college-educated white women. I mean, there's a reason why Gloria Steinem became the face of the movement. There were a couple of very important black female leaders in that movement, but Gloria Steinem was, if we're going to be honest about it, like a pleasing white face on the movement and could like translate it to white America, which held power. And there are lots of reasons why, and we've talked a lot about, intersectionality and feminism is not something that we talked about when I was in college. And now it's lingua franca. Like I remember one of our interns in this channel that we have saying like, who doesn't know what intersectionality is? And I was like, I didn't like talk about intersectionality until a few years ago. So I think that there are some interesting things where now class is becoming an important way that feminists look at what policies they pursue. People have framed the abortion debate in recent years as an issue of class and race, who has access to it. So this is a little bit of a tangent, but I do think that like the split between college and non-college educated white women has deep roots in this country, and it has a lot to do with how non-college educated white women perceive that people are condescending to them, particularly other women.
And this is anecdotal. See, I don't think this is a tangent at all because like I was actually thinking of this when Taylor Swift weighed in on the Tennessee Senate race.
Now you know about Taylor Swift and Katy Perry.
I was thinking about this when Katy Perry weighed in on the Tennessee Senate race that, again, this is anecdotal, but there was reporting after 2016 that a lot of non-college white women found the celebrity advocating for Hillary Clinton almost like offensive. Mm-hmm. I'm like, this shows you my pop culture knowledge, but there was some singer in 2016 who made a big deal out of saying you have to vote for Clinton, and the reporting I was reading on this was like, we're the people who buy your music, and now you're telling us, how to vote. So, I think this stuff gets touchy really quick, and I don't know if this is a way to judge what effect Taylor Swift will have, but I don't like, to Claire's point, I don't think this is a group that sort of likes the way they're talked to or about. I
mean, ask the Dixie Chicks. Ask the Dixie Chicks what voicing political opinions can do as far as like backlash from your listening constituency, right? Like it's interesting to watch people like Taylor Swift is really interesting because her original constituency were people who listen to country music. Country music radio stations are still a really powerful force. They're often like in red states, basically, or they're popular in rural parts of a state. And like she had she's gone pop now, but it is interesting that she chose to weigh in Tennessee, where I think she lives in Tribeca. To be perfectly honest,
from Tennessee.
No, she's originally from Reading, Pennsylvania. But she moved to Tennessee.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Taylor.
Yeah.
I have
associated with Tennessee.
She is. I think she's probably still registered to vote in Tennessee. Anyway, like I think she made a very conscious decision here to weigh in a place she thought she could swing votes. which is interesting in and of itself. Like, I think Taylor Swift is a fascinating celebrity. But, that constituency that she has, she probably offended some people who are like fans of her from early work.
I've been trying to think of another celebrity to confuse Taylor Swift and Katy Perry with, because I thought it would be a funny way to call back the joke, and I can't think of anybody.
Okay. Let's talk about a few other demographic groups and sort of other lenses that we could potentially look at the electorate through. So one is age. And Nate, there was a survey that got a fair amount of attention last week and over the weekend, but this Gallup survey that showed 18 to 29-year-olds are the least enthusiastic to vote, say they're the least enthusiastic to vote, and only 26% say they are certain to vote. That compares with 69% of 50 to 64-year-olds and 82% of people 65 and older. This is a long-standing trend. Young people tend not to vote, especially in midterms. Is this year just going to fit right into that trend, or do we see anything different, or are there signs for alarm here for Democrats?
Look, Democratic turnout is likely to be higher overall than in a typical midterm. But the gains, it seems, are made maybe with groups that are more likely to vote to begin with, and not necessarily with Hispanic voters, not necessarily with young voters. The one caveat I have a little bit is these are groups of voters, young voters and Hispanics, are maybe the two toughest types of voters to get to answer telephone surveys. And so, therefore, I'd say there's a little bit of uncertainty around that. I believe, like the ABC Post poll, we are, of course, work for ABC, showed relatively better participation among young voters. So I think there's potentially a little bit of cherry picking. But yeah, there's no doubt that it's hard to get young voters to the polls in the midterms. That might be a little bit less true this year, but it will still largely be true. And that way less than a majority of young voters will vote.
Yeah.
I mean, what counts as a great turnout for young voters this midterm? It's at 26% right now. I think a lot of our listeners hear that and say, gosh, like that sounds really low.
I
mean, if you had 33, that would be great, right? If you had 30, that would be great. It's usually 24.
It's
22.
a big group, so a couple percentage points make a big difference.
I think the recent record, this is according to a forthcoming article by Jeff Skelly on our site, but I think the recent record for 18 to 29-year-olds was 25% in 2006, a great year for Democrats. So, yeah, I thought that Gallup poll got too much attention, and it is very likely young people will turn out at lower rates this year than other age groups. But I also think it's pretty likely that young voter turnout will be up this year relative to their normal turnout. I could be wrong about that, but that's my
the caveat that we end everything with.
I could be wrong about everything I just said, but
I might not be. And if I'm not, I will take credit for
exactly.
it. Yeah. All right. Any final thoughts here on demographic groups, either circling back to the gender gap or any other groups that we want to keep our eye on?
One thing this is not for the House or Senate, but black turnout in some of these gubernatorial races with black candidates and some of the ones without, I think will be interesting. I think there's this question of like how black voters figure into the Democratic Party post-Obama, and we'll get some like interesting tidbits on that in Georgia and Florida. And
because Stacey Abrams is counting on people being enthusiastic about her. And I mean, actually, in some ways, this reminds me of, it's not a perfect comparison, but the way that Doug Jones kind of convinced black constituencies to turn out in a special election in an off year to vote for him was in part because he could say to them, like, listen, I have a good chance of winning. And I think that that's kind of a Stacey Abrams play, too, which is like, I'm not just a protest candidate here. Like, I have a good chance of winning against this guy who's pretty right wing. We might get some like swing voters, but also I need traditional Democratic constituencies to turn out.
Black voters, young voters.
Please turn out to vote. And some of it comes from like, especially in the South, I think. We talked about this last year, but just those states have huge minority populations, which are traditional Democratic constituencies. But because they are states that have been so long controlled by Republicans, it's also a matter of convincing people like, listen, the Democratic candidate actually has a viable shot. And that seems to be happening more and more. And I think it's I think Stacey Abrams' gambit is really interesting.
No, and again, Perry is writing about this, so I don't want to steal too much from his article. But this was sort of semi-explicit during the campaigns where you had white opponents to these black gubernatorial candidates, basically not them personally, but their supporters kind of intimating, hey, we have to, in order to win this race, we have to win over white moderates in the state. And to do that, we need a white candidate.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's never said that explicitly, but it's never said that implicitly either. It's kind of, in the middle. While, as Claire said, Abrams was making the argument, listen, you've tried that before. You've run all these moderate white candidates as Democrats in these states and lost and lost and lost. Let's try to excite black voters. Let's try to excite young voters. I don't think we know how that will go yet, although Abrams has a decent chance in our forecast.
It's to her advantage that she's running against a very right-wing guy in Kemp, where he might be turning off moderate independents who might swing Republican typically.
Same with Gillum in Florida.
Yeah.
Okay, so Perry is going to join us next. He's actually on to talk about a piece he wrote about for 2020, but maybe we'll get his quick thoughts on this too, since we'll have him on. So we'll hear from Perry Bacon Jr. in a sec and talk about who appears to be getting ready to run in 2020. But first, let me tell you that today's podcast is brought to you by Casper. Casper helps you get the best night's sleep, period. Once you try Casper, you will never go back. Switching to a Casper mattress is a no-brainer. It is a high-quality mattress at an affordable price. You can sleep cool and comfortable every night thanks to the unique combination of foams that provide the right pressure, relief, and alignment. Especially now as fall arrives and the weather shifts, no matter what part of the country you're in. It's a tricky time for temperature control out there, I understand, but Casper will keep you comfortable no matter the season. Casper mattresses ship in a box right to your door for free. The box is so small, you're like, how can there be a mattress in there? But they wouldn't do that to you. There's definitely a mattress in there. You open it up, unfurl it, you can try it out. If you don't like it, they'll even pick it up and refund you everything. From its engineering to its packaging to letting you try it for 100 nights for free, it is no wonder that Casper has over 35,000 5-star reviews on all of their products across Casper, Google, and Amazon. Sleeping on a mattress is the best way to try it. Duh. Sleep on a mattress. That's the best way to try it. Put Casper to the test in your own home for 100 nights risk-free. Go to Casper.com and use the code POLITICS for $50 off. Use that code POLITICS at Casper.com. Get $50 off towards the purchase and trial of select mattresses. Casper.com. Terms and conditions apply. Today's podcast is also brought to you by WordPress. WordPress powers, listen to this stat, more than 30% of all websites, from your favorite local shops to the world's biggest companies. Join a global, high-traffic network of organizations and entrepreneurs when you build your website and your business your way on WordPress.com. WordPress allows you to carve out your own corner of the web, your own little corner of the web just for you with a new custom domain name, or you can use one that you already own and transfer it over. You can create a site that fits you using templates and customizable themes. There's no design experience needed. You're free to import and export content to and from your WordPress site. It's your website, your home, your content. There's a range of e-commerce options to promote and sell, from an easy-to-use payment button to a full-fledged online store. WordPress makes it easy to reach a global market and let customers find you with their built-in SEO. This site will be search-friendly and ready for the world. And moreover, you can get it up and running for just $4 a month. The time to grow your business is now. Build your website today and get 15% off any new plan purchase at WordPress.com/politics. Once again, that's WordPress.com/politics. WordPress.com/politics. We're back, and yes, we are going to talk about who appears to be running in 2020 based on which boxes they have checked so far. And here to do that is Perry Bacon Jr., who did the analysis and came up with the boxes that candidates are checking. Hello, Perry.
Good to be with you guys.
We were planning this segment ahead of time, and then all of a sudden, Senator Elizabeth Warren, I don't know, we can talk about this, maybe kind of released a campaign ad today. Certainly did some stuff that indicates that she's running. But first, how did you come up with the criteria for this, and what are those criteria, Perry?
So we did this piece last year, and I had kind of been thinking about how do we sort of catch the next Donald Trump. It was initially Donald Trump actually went to Iowa and New Hampshire in 2013 and 2014. So he should not have been as much of a surprise as he was treated, because he had been sort of hinting he was going to run. So I looked at, I've covered a few campaigns now. So I looked at sort of things that everybody does before they run. Like I think Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, all those guys like released a book like late 2014, early 2015. So I basically came up with sort of an informal idea. If you go to Iowa, you go to New Hampshire, you go to South Carolina, if you write a book, if you're included in early polls, if you campaign in the midterms for your party's candidates, I think there's a seventh that I'm not remembering offhand here.
Magazine profile.
But anyway, we came up. magazine, like, and that's more about how the political scene views you in some ways. Like if the Atlantic wants to profile you, that's telling of something. And if you agree to do the interview, that often means that you're sort of thinking about it. I mean, I remember I did an interview with Barack Obama in March 2006. And at that point, it was clear to me, I worked at Time Magazine then, that he was somewhat open to exploring the option. And I think that was useful to know back then. So those are kind of the 7 indicators that I've been sort of tracking the last year and a half.
So I want to circle back and get everyone's thoughts on the indicators and if there's anything that's missing from the list, or maybe we should start to add to the list. But give us the leaderboard. Who is checking the most boxes?
So Bernie Sanders was 7 for 7. He's done all of these things. I'm pretty sure the Vice President Biden was at 6. Mm-hmm. Cory Booker was at 5. Elizabeth Warren, a lot of people are at 4 or 5. So that gets to Michael Avenatti, who maybe we think of as maybe less serious. That gets to the Eric Garcettis. The surprises to me were, and again, this is only an indication of a few things, but Eric Holder has done 5 of these things, and Jeff Flake has done 4 of them. I don't think either one of those people are actually going to, announce formal candidacies. But the idea is to rather than like ask Elizabeth Warren 100 times, "Are you running? Are you running?" to sort of look at what people are actually doing. And I would argue like the surprise at this point would be if Bernie Sanders didn't run, mm-hmm. not if he did run, because at this point he's done all this stuff to run. And I think it's worth just thinking about Bernie Sanders as a presidential candidate in 2020 unless we hear otherwise, is how I think of him.
What I like about this list, a couple things. First, what I like about this list is it catches a couple different things. It catches what the potential candidate is doing, right? Visiting states, agreeing to profiles. But it also, in the magazine profile and the poll check marks, it captures a bit of sort of like the market, right?
And that's you're being included in polls. Have
you been
criteria.
Included in at least one national poll? I think we can talk about this, but I think there's a version of this where all these are binary, right? It's like yes or no. I think there's a version of this where you could, if you go to Iowa 10 times instead of 1 time, that counts for something. If you are included in 100% of polls instead of 1 out of 10 polls, that counts for something. But right now, what and Perry Wright says, this list is good at catching people you might not be paying attention to. One of the top people with 5 out of 7 is Steve Bullock, the governor of Montana, right? Who I don't think.
Or Tim Ryan, perpetual Claire Malone favorite for presidential drafts, going back a year.
Exactly.
So thank you, Perry, for your data supporting my hunch.
Jody, you mentioned what I might have missed, and I went back and found this old data set from like 2004 and 2000 and 2008 about who had went to Iowa, South Carolina, and New Hampshire. So that was helpful to look back. But a lot of people wrote into me and said, obviously you're forgetting about Nevada. And that's true. I did not include, that's an early state and probably one that should have been in the consideration. I just didn't have the old data for that state, but that's obviously a key indicator. And it's actually useful because Harris and Warren went there, which, is a smart place to go because it's not like going to Iowa, which gets every reporter's, eyes open. But if you go to Nevada, it's actually is an early state.
Claire, this may be a willfully naive question, but is there any reason why someone would do all of these things and not be setting themselves up for a presidential run? Is there any argument to visit Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, write a book and get profiled and do all these things?
People love attention,
mm-hmm.
and I think it's pretty common for books and magazine profiles and books are like just pretty common in general in politics, and I think like campaigning for other people, blah, 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 like that's a part of the job for a lot of people. The visits to early states are interesting just in general. And some of it might be, for someone like Holder, maybe he got invited to talks and was kind of like, yeah, I'll do, or dinners, and I'll do it. And it's kind of like a little bit of a flattering ego boost where you're like, yeah, maybe I should consider running. I mean, I think the perfect example of this is when John Kerry in this interview kind of said like, well, I wouldn't rule out running for president. And it's like, are you really? Or are you really actually considering this? Or do you just like kind of want a couple days of stories about you? Which I think that's what it is for some people. On the other hand, I actually hadn't realized that Avenatti had been to all 3 of these early states. And that is interesting. Now, he hasn't campaigned with people because he's doing other things. But to me, the biggest indication does tend to be, have you gone to these states? But I think for some people, it's a little bit of like a ego boost.
So one thing that jumps out on that front is Kirsten Gillibrand, who's pretty high, tends to be pretty high on our list when we do drafts. She gets to be drafted pretty early. She has not visited any of Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. Is that
nor has Harris.
Yeah, this is one thing that jumped out. I think what you're seeing is that, so like Gillibrand, Harris, three of like, I think you would have to say the potential front runners have not visited the early states. I think that's because, I don't know if you agree, Perry, but like if Elizabeth Warren went to Iowa, that would be a shitstorm in a way it's not when Steve Bullock goes to Iowa, right? So I think they're probably avoiding it for now. I think after the midterms, I would expect that to change. Also, some of them have elections, right, Perry?
So Harris has announced plans now in the next 3 weeks to go to Iowa and South Carolina. So I just happen to have bad timing. So that's one thing there. But I think in the case of Warren, I agree with Micah that Warren doesn't really need to go to Iowa. She's very famous. Everyone knows she's probably running. I do think Warren, Klobuchar, and Gillibrand are all running for re-election. And I think even if you're a big favorite to win, I don't think it's a great idea to go to all three early states and sort of be over-eager, and it might annoy your – like Hillary Clinton in 2006 did not go to Iowa, New Hampshire, or South Carolina. She was up for re-election. Everyone knew she was running for president, but I think she didn't want to throw it in anyone's face to some extent.
Can I read a tweet from this morning that I think pertains to this, people not wanting to get out ahead of the midterms and the Democratic cause, which is Jim Messina, who was Obama's 2012 campaign manager, tweeted this in response to Elizabeth Warren's ad about her Native American heritage. And he said, "Argue the substance all you want, but why 22 days before a crucial election where we must win the House and Senate to save America, did Senator Warren have to do her announcement now? Why can't Democrats ever stay focused?" 3 question marks. So I do think that there's some sense of people who run these campaigns and that you don't want to get out over your skis before you have the election all done and over with. Mike is giving away.
I don't know, Jim Messina.
I'll answer that because there's a first mover advantage. The day after the midterms, you'll have a phase where the main politics story is in some sense 2020 and the primaries leading up to 2020 and the Democratic primary in particular. And if you get out in front of the story and build momentum, begin to get money, begin to crowd out other people who are more tentative, particularly Bernie.
I think there's a rivalry between Warren and Sanders.
I mean, Sanders is, if we have a chat or something a year ago where I'm like, yeah, Sanders is the favorite to win the Democratic nomination or the front runner.
You did say that.
Yeah. The front runner.
And I think I pushed back on that.
He is not polling well.
Mm-hmm. There was a big poll over the weekend.
I'm not sure I'd call anything a big poll.
Right, there was a poll over the weekend that got a lot of reaction. Sorry, let me frame that the right way.
It was a small little poll
that got an outsized response.
Wait, what poll?
It was a CNN national poll of the 2020 race. I think Biden was at 33%. Sanders was at 13%. And everybody else was in single digits.
Can I just say, I don't know Jim Messina. I'm sure he's a perfectly fine guy. But
you, sir, are no.
No, but that question, that question is asinine. Why should someone who's thinking about running for president do things that she thinks will help her run for president? Because that's what politicians do and have done since the dawn of existence.
But she's a Democrat. She should. I think his argument is she should care about the larger Democratic project. And currently, the most important thing is for Democrats to try and take back the House in the midterms. This potentially provides
this is a stupid
distraction. I mean,
if you're someone
channeling
who thinks,
my inner Messina,
if you're someone who thinks that Elizabeth Warren's DNA test matters to the midterms, that's pretty disqualifying, right? Exactly. You should not be giving strategic advice to anyone if you think this story is going to last more than about 6 hours.
Let me ask a sort of larger think question here, which is a lot of the things that are on our list are the traditional things that for, generations candidates have done to set themselves up. So is there anything here about indicating that 2020 is going to look like a normal election where candidates have to visit their normal states and do the normal profile raising and raise money in the normal ways? Or should we be thinking more outside the box, more, less party decides and more Trump scrambled everything?
How much money did you raise from small donations?
Should that be on your list? Should that be on the list?
No, I'm just bringing up Beto O'Rourke because people got really excited last week by how much money he'd raised and immediately started comparing it to Obama's one of his quarters in 2006
you could have a fundraising,
or 7, something like that.
But to Perry's point, Trump was doing these things.
Yeah.
Right, Perry?
Yeah.
So I mean, the lesson is kind of like Trump was more conventional than we remember, and so the conventional criteria still kind of matter.
I would say, like, for the Democratic primary particularly, if I had a sort of appeared on Pod Save America sign, that would be a useful one. Like, we're talking about new things people are doing. Like, pretty
fireside
much all
chat.
these people have done Pod Save America. I think all of them, like, I talked to one of the candidates' staffs. All of them are very focused on building this small donor base. Like, I think if you looked at like most online videos produced, I think Harris and Warren are really high on producing these. They're producing all these online videos to build a list so they can raise money for the way Beto is doing. Claire is totally right about that. I'm not sure. And those are new things that I think were not happening as much in 2000. I know Obama raised money online, but it's different now.
I would call it a Sanders started emphasis on not just, I get a lot of small donations. It's, I don't take money from PACs, or the majority of my fundraising comes from these small dollar donors. And I do think it's like this in the Democratic sphere of things. It's this new paradigm where you want to prove that you're kind of anti-corporate in some way. And that is an important part of saying, like, I understand the mood of the party.
Yeah, so you could add, like, to your original question, Jody, I think you could add a appear on liberal podcasts, check mark. You could add a fundraising one.
Pod Save America, its own column now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But do I think part of why I like our checklist again is, do I think any serious presidential candidate running in the Democratic primary in 2020 is not going to go to Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina? No. Also, like, even if someone really outside the box does sort of start to make noise, there's stuff on here, book, poll, magazine profile, which should at least theoretically pick up on some of that, pick up kind of the wisdom of the crowd. So, like, I don't think this checklist is like prone to missing people because it's traditional. I think it has some flexibility there.
Let's start to wrap up. But Perry, I did notice there are at least 3 Republicans on your list: Jeff Flake, John Kasich, Ben Sasse. Anything to say about them? Were you surprised to see them pop up?
Kasich has been basically sort of running for president against Trump since the primary ended in 2016. So that surprised me. Flake, I do think the chart maybe like Flake and like Mitch Landrieu, I think, happened to do something important in terms of getting the Confederate monuments taken down in New Orleans, and that got a lot of attention. I do think Landrieu and Flake sort of happened to do stuff that hit a lot of my signals, but I don't think either one of them is running. I do think there's a chance Kasich runs. Ben Sasse went to Iowa once, but I don't get the sense he's running. But I think the fact that he went to Iowa tells you that Ben Sasse wants to run, like, at some point, but probably, and I think all 3 of these guys maybe thought if Trump's numbers were in the 20s, or if he was, 40% approval among Republicans, I do think Kasich, Sasse, and probably Kasich and Sasse would probably think about running. But I think the fact that Trump is so popular among Republicans has probably scared them off from that.
Iowa and Nebraska, I should point out, are next door to each other, so that geography could just account for.
He stepped over the border and made Perry's list. Nate?
I mean, I think there are Republicans who will run as a book tour event.
Right.
As a book tour media.
God bless Ben Carson's strategy.
But look, there is some, it's the same.
But wait, Nate, you're saying, to be clear, you're saying they'll float the possibility of running, leave it a little vague as their book is coming out, sell a lot of books, get a lot of attention, then not do it.
Jeff Flake runs, he gets margins ranging from 15% to 37% of the vote, depending on the state. Bows out at an appropriate time. I don't know. I'm a little skeptical.
Some of this is also like, I mean, a lot of these people have been in politics for a really long time, and like, this is what you do, right? They feel like, well, I've reached this step in my career, and like, I want to try this out. Even if they kind of know that it might not bring anything, it's like a thing to do.
No, and we were very careful, and Perry was very careful in the article. I mean, we frame all this as like, who might be thinking about running, who's keeping the option open. I don't think this is an attempt, nor should it be interpreted that way, to predict, hey, here are the people running for president. It's meant to get at this particular stage in the process where no one's, very few. We've had a couple declares. Delaney has declared, a couple other people. But it's much more informal, and so it's meant to get at that more amorphous phase of who's thinking about it, who's dipping a toe in, who's dipping a leg in, who's diving in, you know.
So, Perry, final thought from you. How quickly after this year's midterms will more and more of these boxes get checked? I mean, is it right into 2020 on November 7th?
I think so. Like my piece published on, we finish it Wednesday at 6 and today is Monday at, noon. And already I know Harris has agreed to go to 2 early states. I do think you're going to see a lot of people sort of aggressively checking out these boxes. I do think it'll be interesting to see who actually says I'm running for president in November and December versus who sort of hires people and waits till there's a reason to wait till January because then the next financial quarter starts then. So you have 3 months to, raise your money because everybody wants to have a big 3 months of fundraising total. So I think you might have some candidates who wait till January to, have their big event in Boston or LA that they're running. But I think you'll have a lot of visits to Iowa in part because it's now like a race to it because Booker went to Iowa a few weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. And I think that probably, if I'm Harris, I am thinking, he's, we're in the sort of same lane probably. I need to get out there. And I think you're going to see people sort of chasing each other now that there's a few of the sort of top tier candidates. Like if Gillibrand or Klobuchar, I assume will go to Iowa in November if they do well in their reelections. And I think you'll see more of this pretty soon after the midterms.
Let me just give listeners the official 538 editorial position read 2020. It is never too early.
Never too early.
It's never too early to cover a presidential campaign. These people are already thinking about it. They're already planning for it. So that's one reason why it's never too early. The other reason I really, really hate that it's too early is because anytime we publish anything on 2020, it gets a million readers. So all these, it's like the media hand wringing who are like, it's too early, it's too early. They're the people reading about the election. So
that's not the only criteria we use for our editorial decisions, but it is a good indicator.
Excuse me. That's not. I'm just saying, it's like people are interested in it.
It's out there.
It matters. The candidates are doing it. Like it meets all the criteria for covering journalistically.
For instance, this podcast episode is surely going to be incredibly popular. Everyone's going to use every promo code.
We're gonna put 2020 in the episode title, and I guarantee it does.
Click, sheeple.
Okay, Perry Bacon Jr., thank you very much. That was really great.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks to you, Nate Silver.
Thank you,
Claire. Thanks. It's better than the intro.
Yeah, that's
Claire.
true.
Thanks, Jody.
And Micah, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
My name is Jody Avergan. Galen Druk is our producer. Tony Chow is in the control room. A quick plug, we have a live show on the 9th of November, Friday. That's the Friday after the election. It's at the 92nd Street Y. There are still some tickets available, so you can go to 538.com/live. And per our conversation just now, I'll be curious to see how much we look back at the midterm versus we're already in 2020 mode, and it's just our first ever live show of the 2020. We'll see. We will do a balance. It'll be fun. So come join us on Friday the 9th. You can find tickets at 538.com/live.
Again, I want to emphasize there's a 40% chance that people are like, why were the polls so wrong? How did Democrats win the Senate? How did Republicans win the House? There's a 40% chance that one of those two things will happen. So if you come to that live podcast taping, I'm going to play this clip. If you're like, oh my God, incredibly shocking. No, not really.
Jesus.
Wow.
Even the ads people have content.
You should write that article, Nate.
Yeah.
Write it now. Okay.
It won't matter. We wrote that article 57 million times in 2016.
Still, we should write it.
So still come to the live show. It'll be a very warm place where all ideas will be welcome. You can find information at I'm joking. In other news, 30 for 30 podcast, new season launches tomorrow. Micah's wearing the sweatshirt in anticipation. I appreciate that, Micah.
These are the most comfortable sweatshirts in the podcast game. And
is a very comfortable podcast to listen to. Coming out tomorrow, Tuesday.
I find it comfortable when I'm wearing the sweatshirt and listening.
Get in touch by emailing us, podcast@538.com. You can also, of course, tweet at us with any questions or comments about the show. If you're a fan, leave us a rating or review in the Apple Podcast Store. When you leave a rating, it helps our rankings, which helps others discover the show. Or just go up to someone and say, hey, you should listen to the 538 Politics Podcast. It's a great icebreaker. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.